大家好，我是 Jenny， 欢迎来到沉思者 J。今天我们要认识的这位大师，是一个走进了人类灵魂最幽暗角落的探索者。他不只是一位心理学家，他是一个神话学者和炼金术研究者。他是一个占星观察者和梦境解析师。他说，我们每个人的内心深处都住着一个古老的宇宙。他就是卡尔·古斯塔夫·荣格，分析心理学的奠基者，集体无意识理论的创造者，一个让现代人重新理解自己灵魂的人。让我们从一个梦说起。1913年的冬天，荣格做了一个极为奇异的梦。他梦见整个欧洲大陆被洪水淹没，黄色的洪流夹带着尸体和废墟滚滚而来。这个梦让他深感不安，他反复思考，这到底意味着什么？几个月后，第一次世界大战爆发了。荣格意识到，他在梦中所看到的不只是个人的恐惧，而是整个人类集体心灵深处的预兆。这个体验深刻塑造了他后来提出的一个核心概念——集体无意识。在荣格之前，心理学的世界里有另一个巨人，他的名字叫西格蒙德·弗洛伊德。弗洛伊德认为，人类行为的根源在于压抑的性冲动和童年创伤。他把无意识比作一个黑暗的地窖，里面藏着各种不能说的欲望。弗洛伊德非常欣赏荣格，他甚至公开称荣格为自己的精神继承人。他说，荣格将是心理分析运动的未来。但荣格并不满足于这个角色，他有自己的疑问。他想知道，人类的心灵难道只是欲望的容器吗？难道灵魂的深处没有更宏大的东西吗？1912年，荣格出版了一本书，书名叫做《转化的象征》。在这本书里，他系统性地挑战了弗洛伊德的观点。他认为，性冲动只是人类动力的一部分，人类还有更广泛的心灵能量，他称之为利比多。这个概念远比弗洛伊德的版本更加丰富。弗洛伊德看到这本书之后，勃然大怒。两人之间长达6年的深厚友谊就此决裂。据说弗洛伊德在读完这本书后对人说，荣格已经背叛了我。而荣格则在后来的自传里写道，那一刻的分离让我开始成为真正的自己。荣格出生于1875年，地点是瑞士的凯斯维尔镇，一个安静的乡村小镇，紧邻康士坦兹湖。他的父亲保罗是一位乡村牧师，一个在信仰中苦苦挣扎的人。父亲的疑惑和痛苦深深影响了年幼的荣格，让他从小就对宗教和灵性问题充满困惑与好奇。母亲艾米丽则是一个截然不同的存在。她白天是个普通的家庭主妇，但到了夜晚，她似乎会进入另一种人格，说着奇异的话语，如同另一个人在说话。多年后，荣格将母亲这种现象称为人格解离，而他后来提出的人格面具理论，或许就种下了最初的种子。荣格的童年有一个著名的秘密，他在大约10岁的时候，雕刻了一个小小的木质人偶，大约7公分长。他把这个人偶藏在阁楼的一块石头下，旁边还放了一块用鹅毛笔写满秘密语言的小石头。每当他感到被误解或者心情难受的时候，他就会悄悄爬上阁楼，想象自己在和那个人偶说话。在那个时刻，他感到一种奇妙的平静。多年后，当荣格研究世界各地的神话和原始文化时，他惊讶地发现，这种在秘密地点藏匿神圣物件的仪式，几乎出现在全球每一个原始文化之中。北美印第安人有他们的图腾，西非部落有他们的护身符，西伯利亚萨满教有他们的神器。这个发现让荣格深信，人类的心灵深处存在着一个共同的文化基础。这就是他所说的集体无意识的核心证据之一。集体无意识是什么？让我们用一个比喻来解释。想象人类的心灵就像一座巨大的冰山，浮在水面上的那一小部分是我们的意识，是我们知道自己在想什么，在做什么的那个层面。水面下那更大的部分是个人无意识，是我们忘记了或压抑了的个人记忆和经验。但在冰山最深的底部还有另一个层次，那是所有人类共同拥有的无意识基础，是几百万年人类进化积累下来的集体记忆。 这就是集体无意识。荣格说，这个地方住着各种古老的模式，他把它们称为原型。原型这个概念是荣格思想的核心。什么是原型呢？原型是人类心灵中普遍存在的象指性模式，比如英雄，比如大母神，比如智慧老人，比如阴影，比如阿尼玛和阿尼姆斯。这些原型不是某个特定文化的产物，而是所有人类共同拥有的心灵结构。你有没有注意到一件有趣的事情？全世界的神话故事结构惊人的相似。希腊神话里有英雄赫拉克勒斯历经12项试炼，中国神话里有孙悟空历经9981难取西经，北欧神话里有奥丁挂在世界树上换取智慧，美索不达米亚神话里有吉尔加美什跨越死亡之水寻找不死药。这些故事相隔千山万水，相差数千年。为什么结构如此相似？荣格说，因为它们都源自同一个地方，那个人类集体无意识深处的原型库。英雄原型、死亡与众生原型、伟大母亲原型，这些模式如此根深蒂固，以至于人类不管在哪里，不管在哪个时代，都会自发地创造出类似的故事。现在我们来说说荣格最有趣的几个原型概念。第一个叫做阴影。阴影是什么？阴影就是你不愿意承认的那个自己，是你压抑在心底的愤怒和贪婪和恐惧，是你在别人身上最讨厌的那些特质。荣格说，你越是讨厌某人身上的某种特质，那种特质往往越是你自己内心深藏的部分。这听起来有点严苛，但仔细想想，是不是很有道理？那些让我们最抓狂的人，往往照出了我们自己的某个侧面。荣格说，我们不能消灭阴影，我们只能认识它，接受它，整合它。一个人如果否认自己的阴影，那阴影就会在暗处积聚力量，在最意想不到的时刻爆发出来。这个道理，无论在个人心理学还是在政治历史上，都一再应验。那些最道貌岸然的人，往往是最终倒塌最剧烈的人。第二个重要原型是阿尼玛和阿尼姆斯。在荣格的理论里，每个男性的心灵深处都有一个女性的原型形象，称为阿尼玛，而每个女性的心灵深处都有一个男性的原型形象，称为阿尼姆斯。这不是说男人内心有个女人，女人内心有个男人，而是说我们每个人的心灵都是两种能量的复合体，男性气质和女性气质，阳刚与阴柔，主动与接纳。荣格说，心理的成熟在于整合这两种能量。一个只知道强硬而不懂柔软的男人是不完整的，一个只知道包容而无法坚定的女人也是不完整的。这个概念与中国哲学中的阴阳思想惊人的契合，阳中有阴，阴中有阳，两种力量相互包含和相互转化。荣格本人也非常清楚这一点，他对中国哲学的研究深度令许多东方学者都感到惊讶。说到荣格与东方哲学，就不得不说一件非常有趣的事。荣格是第一批真正深入研究易经的西方心理学家之一。易经，这部中国最古老的智慧典籍，在西方世界曾经长期被视为迷信和占卜术。是荣格和他的同道者把易经带进了严肃的学术讨论中。荣格为魏礼贤翻译的易经英文版写了一篇序言，在那篇序言里，荣格提出了一个震惊学界的概念，他称之为共时性。什么是共时性？共时性指的是两个在时间上同时发生的事件，它们之间没有因果关系，但它们之间存在着意义上的联系。比如，你正在想某个老朋友，突然电话就响了，正是那个老朋友打来的。再比如，你在书店随手拿起一本书翻开，恰好看到了你昨晚梦到的那个词语。西方科学说这只是巧合，但荣格说，也许巧合本身就是一种意义的显现。易经的占卜系统本质上就建立在共识性的基础上。你在某一刻抛出铜钱或排列湿草，那个时刻的宇宙状态就包含在那次排列之中。这个想法对西方思维来说是革命性的，它挑战了线性因果论的基本假设。荣格说，也许宇宙中存在着我们尚未理解的连接方式。荣格不只研究易经， 他对藏传佛教也有深入的研究。他为西藏度王经的音译版写了心理学评注。西藏度王经，也就是通常所说的西藏生死书，是藏传佛教关于死亡与转世过程的重要典籍。荣格发现，书中描述的死后意识状态，与他在病人身上观察到的深度心灵解离状态有着惊人的相似性。他认为，藏传佛教的修行传统本质上是一种深度的心灵探索系统，只是用了不同的语言和框架来描述。这种跨文化的视角，在当时的西方学界是非常罕见的。荣格用他的方式，为东西方的心灵传统架起了一座桥梁。在荣格思想中，还有一个非常重要的概念：个体化。个体化不是个人主义，个体化指的是一个人成为真正的自己的过程，是整合自己人格中所有面向的过程，包括光明面和阴暗面，包括意识和无意识，包括理性和直觉。荣格说，真正的人格成长不是消除冲突，而是在冲突中找到一个更高的整合点。就像中国哲学中说的那样，在对立中寻找统一。个体化是一生的旅程，它没有终点，它是一个不断向内探索、不断扩展自我认识的持续过程。荣格晚年建造了一座石塔，就在苏黎世湖边的柏林根。他用自己的双手一块一块地砌筑那些石头。他说，那座塔是他灵魂的具体化，每一块石头都代表着他个体化旅程中的一个章节。他在那里独居，没有电力，没有现代设施，只有自然和沉默和内心的声音。荣格对梦境的重视，也是他理论的重要组成部分。弗洛伊德把梦视为被压抑欲望的伪装表达，荣格则认为梦是无意识向意识发送的信息。梦不是在掩盖什么，而是在揭示什么。梦用象征性的语言说话，就像神话和童话一样。荣格建立了一套极为丰富的梦境分析系统。他认为，分析梦境必须了解做梦者的整个生命脉络。他的治疗方式不像弗洛伊德那样侧重童年创伤的追溯，更注重的是，此刻这个人的灵魂需要走向哪里，需要整合什么，需要认识什么。他说，不是你找到了问题，问题就解决了，而是你必须找到一个更大的自己，让问题的意义改变。1913年，也就是与弗洛伊德决裂之后的那个冬天，荣格进入了他生命中最黑暗的时期。他把这个时期称为与无意识的对峙。他感到自己的精神开始瓦解，各种幻象和奇异的意象涌现而来。他的家人和同事都为他担心，但荣格做了一个惊人的决定。他选择主动进入那个黑暗之中。他开始在日记本上记录所有涌现的意象和幻象。他画图，他书写，他对话。他给那些在黑暗中说话的声音起了名字，和他们对话。这个过程持续了将近6年。这段经历最终成为他最重要的著作之一的基础。那本书叫做《红书》，是一本手工制作的羊皮纸大书。荣格用毛笔书写，并亲自绘制了精美的彩色插图。但他从未公开这本书。这本书在他去世之后，被家人锁在一个金属箱子里长达48年。直到2009年，这本书才终于出版，立刻引发了全球的轰动。人们看到，在那些充满梦境与神话意象的页面上，一个人类志士史上最深刻的心灵，正在与自身的深渊搏斗，并且最终找到了光。荣格晚年的生活充实而丰盛，他不断地写作和旅行。他探访过非洲的原始部落，观察他们的神话和仪式。他去过新墨西哥的普维部落印第安人聚居地。他到过印度，研究印度教和佛教的传统。每一次旅行都让他对集体无意识的理论有了新的印证。1951年，他出版了《心理学与炼金术》，一本让很多人困惑的书。为什么一个心理学家要研究中世纪的炼金术？荣格说，炼金术不只是把铅变成金的伪科学，炼金术是真正在做的事，是一种心灵的转化工程。那些神秘的图像和符号，是人类心灵在没有现代心理学语言的情况下，尝试描述无意识过程的方式。荣格用现代心理学的语言重新解读了整个炼金术传统。 这个研究在学界引发了巨大的震惊和争议，也再次展现了荣格思维的惊人广度。荣格在1961年6月6日去世，享年85岁。就在他去世前几天，他还在工作，修改文稿。他去世的那天，据家人说，窗外的一棵大树被闪电击中，就像是天地在告别一位古老的智者。那么，荣格的思想为什么在今天依然如此重要呢？我想说3个面向。第一，它让我们理解了人类共通的底层结构。在这个全球化的时代，不同文化之间的冲突和误解无处不在。但荣格的集体无意识理论告诉我们，在所有文化的表层差异之下，存在着人类共同的心灵基础。我们对英雄故事的共鸣，对死亡的恐惧，对爱的渴望，都根植于同一个深处。这个视角是促进文化理解和人类和解的重要思想基础。第二，它让我们认识了自己的阴影。在当今这个强调正能量、追求完美形象的时代，荣格提醒我们，否认阴影才是最危险的事。一个个人如此，一个社会亦如此，一个国家也如此。那些以正义之名实施暴行的时刻，往往就是集体阴影爆发的时刻。认识自己的阴影，是防止它在黑暗中积累力量的唯一方式。这个洞见，在任何时代都是切中要害的。第三，它为现代人的灵性探索提供了一个心理学的框架。现代社会很多人既无法回归传统宗教的怀抱，又感到纯粹的物质主义生活空洞无聊。荣格的理论提供了一个中间路径，你不必信仰某个特定的神灵，但你可以认识到，人类心灵中存在着超越个人自我的更大维度。你可以在神话、在梦境、在艺术中、在自然之中，去触碰那个古老而深邃的集体无意识。在那里，也许你会找到属于自己的意义。今天聊了很多荣格的故事和思想，我想留给你一个荣格说过的话。他说，你生命中未曾活出的那部分，就会称为你的命运。意思是，那些你压抑的，那些你否认的，那些你没有勇气去探索的部分，不会就此消失，它们会在你的生命中反复以各种形式出现，以你的梦境，以你的困境，以你的人际关系和身体症状，来呼唤你去认识它，去整合它，去活出它。这句话送给每一个正在探索自我的你。我是 Jenny， 我们下次见咯。Hello everyone, I am Jenny. Welcome to Thinker J. Today we meet a man who ventured into the darkest and most luminous corridors of the human soul. He was not merely a psychologist. He was a mythologist, a student of alchemy, an interpreter of dreams, and a tireless explorer of ancient wisdom from every corner of the world. He believed that deep inside every human being lives an ancient and boundless universe. His name was Carl Gustav Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, the creator of the theory of the collective unconscious, a man who gave modern humanity a profoundly new language for understanding the soul. Let us begin with a dream. In the winter of 1913, Jung had a profoundly strange vision. He saw the entire European continent submerged beneath a great flood. Yellow waters churned with debris, ruins, and bodies. The vision repeated itself across several months, growing more vivid each time. The dream disturbed him deeply. He turned it over and over in his mind. He could not shake the feeling that it meant something beyond his own personal fears. Then, within months, the First World War erupted across Europe. Millions of lives were swept away in the catastrophe that followed. Jung realized that what he had witnessed in his vision was not merely a personal anxiety. It was a premonition rising from the deepest layers of the collective human psyche. Something vast and shared by all of humanity had been trying to speak through the imagery of his dreams. This experience became one of the cornerstones of the concept he would spend his entire life developing: the collective unconscious. Before Jung, the world of psychology already had another towering figure. His name was Sigmund Freud. Freud believed that the driving forces behind human behavior were repressed sexual impulses and unresolved childhood trauma. He described the unconscious as a dark cellar filled with forbidden and shameful desires. Freud admired Jung enormously from the moment they met. He publicly named Jung his intellectual heir and the crown prince of psychoanalysis. He declared that Jung would carry the torch of the psychoanalytic movement into the future. But Jung could not accept this role with a quiet mind. He had questions of his own that Freud could not answer. Was the human mind truly nothing more than a container of suppressed desires? Was there not something far grander and more mysterious in the depths of the soul? In 1912, Jung published a work titled Symbols of Transformation. In this book, he mounted a careful and systematic challenge to Freudian doctrine. He argued that sexual energy was only one expression of a much broader psychic energy. He called this wider force by the name libido, but in a sense far richer and more expansive than Freud had intended. When Freud read the finished book, he was furious. Their 6-year friendship, one of the most celebrated intellectual partnerships in history, collapsed completely and painfully. Freud reportedly told his inner circle that Jung had betrayed the entire movement. Jung, looking back many years later in his autobiography, wrote something quietly remarkable. He wrote that the moment of separation was the moment he began to become truly himself. The rupture with Freud was not simply an intellectual disagreement. It was a deeply personal and painful severing of what had felt like a father and son relationship. Freud had been the first great mind to genuinely recognize the gifts of Jung and take him seriously as a thinker. Jung had looked to Freud with something close to filial love and admiration. The collapse of that bond left Jung profoundly alone in the intellectual world. His colleagues at the time of the rupture largely sided with Freud. Jung lost friendships, professional alliances, and much of the institutional support he had built. He was effectively cast out of the psychoanalytic movement he had helped build. This period of isolation was devastating, but it was also ultimately liberating. It forced Jung to stand entirely on his own ground, to trust his own perceptions and observations, even when no authority backed him. This willingness to stand alone in intellectual conviction, even at great personal cost, was one of the defining qualities of his character. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in the small Swiss town of Keswil, situated on the southern shore of Lake Constance. His father Paul was a rural pastor, a thoughtful and sensitive man who was quietly tormented by private doubts about his own faith. The young Jung watched his father wrestle with belief and find no peace, and this left a deep and lasting impression. From early childhood, Jung found himself haunted by questions of religion, the hidden workings of the spirit, and the nature of the soul. His mother Emily was a strikingly different kind of person. By day she was an ordinary housewife, warm and practical. But at night she sometimes seemed to slip into an altered state. She would speak in strange voices, as though another personality had taken residence within her. Young Jung observed this with a mixture of fascination and unease. Many years later, he would recognize in his mother what he called a personality dissociation. The seeds of his later thinking about the layers of human identity were perhaps first planted in those early childhood observations. Jung had a famous childhood secret that became one of the most revealing windows into his later intellectual life. When he was around 10 years old, he carved a small wooden figure with his own hands. It was about 7 centimeters long. He hid this figure beneath a stone in the attic of the family home. Beside it he placed a smooth pebble on which he had written words in a private secret language that no one else could read. Whenever he felt misunderstood, isolated, or troubled by something he could not explain, he would quietly climb the stairs to the attic. He would sit with the hidden figure and imagine speaking with it. In those moments, a strange and reliable peace would settle over him. He never fully understood why until much later. When Jung eventually began studying mythology and indigenous cultures from around the world, he made a discovery that stopped him in his tracks. This same ritual, the hiding of a sacred object in a secret and protected place, appeared in virtually every ancient culture on Earth. North American indigenous peoples had their sacred totems. West African communities had their protective ritual objects. The shamans of Siberia had their consecrated instruments of power. The patterns were too consistent and too widespread to be coincidental. This discovery became one of the most important pieces of evidence in building his theory of the collective unconscious. It convinced him that the human psyche across all cultures and all centuries shares a common and ancient deep foundation. Before we move to the collective unconscious itself, let us pause on one more important concept. Jung described what he called the persona. The persona is the mask we wear in social life. The carefully constructed presentation of ourselves that we show to the world. Our professional manner, our social politeness, our cultivated reputation. The persona is not false in itself. We all need social masks to navigate ordinary life. The problem arises when we confuse the mask with the face beneath. When we forget that the persona is a performance and begin to believe it is who we truly are. Jung observed that many of his patients suffered precisely from this confusion. They had invested so much energy in maintaining their public persona that they had lost contact with their authentic inner life. The work of individuation requires remembering that behind every mask, there is a living, breathing, often deeply conflicted human being. So what exactly is the collective unconscious? Let us approach it through a vivid image. Imagine the human psyche as a vast iceberg floating in a dark ocean. The small portion visible above the waterline represents our conscious mind. This is the layer where we know what we are thinking, what we are choosing, and what we are doing. Beneath the surface lies a much larger portion that we cannot directly see. This is the personal unconscious. It holds the memories we have forgotten, the experiences we have suppressed, and the emotional material we have pushed out of awareness. But at the very deepest bottom of the iceberg, far below any personal history, there is yet another layer. This is the foundation shared by all human beings across all of recorded and unrecorded history. It is the accumulated inheritance of millions of years of human experience and survival. Patterns and responses and images so deeply embedded in the human organism that they are present in every person ever born, regardless of culture, language, or century. This is what Jung called the collective unconscious. And Jung said that this deepest place is inhabited by fundamental organizing patterns. He called them archetypes. The concept of archetypes is at the heart of everything Jung built. What is an archetype? An archetype is a universal symbolic pattern that exists as a structural feature of every human mind. Not something learned from culture or family, but something present from the very beginning, like an instinct of the psyche. Among the most powerful archetypes Jung identified were the following. The hero, the figure who must face great trials, descend into danger, and return transformed. The great mother, the figure of nourishing abundance and terrifying devouring power combined. The wise old man, the guide who appears at moments of crisis to offer unexpected wisdom. The shadow, the hidden and rejected aspect of the self. The anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine dimensions of every human soul. The trickster, the disruptive boundary-crossing figure who breaks rules and transforms situations. These patterns are not the product of any particular culture. They are structural features of the human mind itself, inherited from our deepest evolutionary past. Consider something remarkable. Myths from every corner of the world, separated by oceans and thousands of years, share astonishing structural similarities. In Greek mythology, Heracles must complete 12 seemingly impossible labors before he can find peace. In Chinese mythology, the Monkey King endures 81 trials on the great journey to the western heavens. In Norse mythology, the god Odin hangs on the world tree for 9 days and nights, sacrificing himself to himself, in order to receive the gift of cosmic wisdom. In the ancient Sumerian tradition, the goddess Inanna descends willingly into the underworld, dying and being reborn. In the Mesopotamian epic, Gilgamesh crosses the waters of death itself in search of the secret of immortality. Why do these stories echo each other so powerfully across such enormous distances of geography and time? Jung said the answer is that they all flow from the same source. They are all expressions of the same universal archetypes residing in the collective unconscious. The hero who must face the ordeal. The death and rebirth that leads to transformation. The descent into darkness and the return to light. These patterns are so deeply embedded in the human mind that people everywhere, in every age, spontaneously generate similar stories. Not because they copied each other, but because they all drew from the same inner well. Let us linger a little longer on synchronicity, because it is one of the concepts that most directly connects Jung to the Eastern philosophical traditions. The philosopher and physicist Wolfgang Pauli, one of the founding figures of quantum mechanics, was actually a patient and later a collaborator of Jung. Their correspondence and collaborative work over many years produced the book The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche. In this unusual partnership between a depth psychologist and a quantum physicist, the two men explored the possibility that synchronicity might represent a fundamental principle of the universe. One that could not be captured by the classical physics model of cause and effect. Pauli was convinced that quantum physics was pointing toward a reality in which the separation between observer and observed, between mind and matter, was not as absolute as classical science had assumed. Jung found in quantum physics a scientific language that gestured toward the same territory he was exploring in the psyche. The idea that reality at its deepest level is participatory. That the boundaries between inner and outer, between psyche and world, are more porous than ordinary experience suggests. This is a conversation that continues today in the fields of consciousness studies, quantum biology, and the philosophy of mind. Jung was decades ahead of his time in sensing that this territory needed to be taken seriously. Let us now look more closely at some of the most practically important archetypes in Jung framework. The first and perhaps most essential is the shadow. What is the shadow? The shadow is the sum of everything in yourself that you refuse to acknowledge. It is the anger you tell yourself you do not feel. It is the envy that lives beneath your generous surface. It is the fear that hides behind your confident appearance. It is the selfishness you deny while congratulating yourself on your virtue. It is, very specifically, the qualities you find most infuriating and unacceptable in other people. And here Jung made one of his boldest and most challenging observations. He said that the qualities you find most intolerable in others are very often the qualities most deeply buried within yourself. Your intense reaction to someone else is often a recognition, below the level of conscious awareness, of something you have not yet faced in yourself. This idea may feel uncomfortable. But if we sit with it honestly, it has a way of ringing uncomfortably true. Jung was clear that we cannot destroy the shadow by ignoring it. Refusing to acknowledge the shadow does not eliminate it. It drives it underground, where it accumulates energy and pressure. It waits. And it erupts at the least expected and most damaging moments. History gives us devastating examples of this pattern playing out not only in individuals but in entire political movements and nations. The most outwardly righteous and morally certain figures sometimes collapse most catastrophically when their shadow erupts. Jung said the only real answer is to turn toward the shadow with honesty and courage. To recognize it, name it, and begin the work of integrating it into a more complete understanding of who we truly are. The second important archetypal concept is the anima and the animus. In Jungian psychology, every man carries within his psyche a feminine archetypal image. Jung called this image the anima. And every woman carries within her psyche a masculine archetypal image. Jung called this the animus. It is important to be clear about what this means and what it does not mean. This does not mean that a man has a woman living inside him, or that a woman secretly harbors a man. What it means is that every human psyche is a living composite of two fundamental energies and modes of being. The energy associated with the masculine, directness, assertion, logic, the drive to act and define. And the energy associated with the feminine, receptivity, intuition, connection, the capacity to feel and include. Both energies exist in every human being, regardless of biological sex or gender identity. Jung said that genuine psychological maturity requires integrating both. A person who lives only in rigid assertion and never allows receptivity is cut off from half of the available life. A person who lives only in accommodation and cannot find the capacity to assert is equally incomplete. This idea resonates with remarkable power when placed beside the classical Chinese understanding of yin and yang. Each force contains the seed of its opposite at its center. Yin within yang, yang within yin. The two are not opposing enemies but complementary partners in a continuous dance of transformation. Jung was very much aware of this resonance and found it deeply meaningful. His engagement with Chinese philosophy ran far deeper than most of his Western contemporaries would have expected or attempted. This brings us to one of the most fascinating chapters in the entire story of Jung's intellectual life. Jung was among the first Western psychologists to engage seriously, personally, and with genuine scholarly depth with the I Ching. The I Ching, the Book of Changes, is one of the oldest texts of Chinese wisdom. For a very long time in the Western world, it had been dismissed as mere superstition, primitive fortune-telling, and pre-scientific magical thinking. It was Jung and his circle who brought the I Ching into serious academic consideration. Jung wrote the foreword to Richard Wilhelm German translation of the I Ching. In that foreword, Jung introduced a concept that startled and divided the scholarly world. He called it synchronicity. What is synchronicity? Synchronicity describes two events that occur simultaneously in time. They share no direct causal connection. One did not cause the other. And yet they share an unmistakable meaningful connection. Here are two simple examples. You are sitting quietly and find yourself thinking of an old friend you have not seen or spoken to in years. At that exact moment, your phone rings, and it is that friend calling. Or you reach for a book at random from a library shelf, open it to a random page, and find exactly the phrase or concept you were thinking about the night before. Western science dismisses these as coincidences. Random events that our pattern-hungry minds invest with false meaning after the fact. But Jung proposed a different possibility. He said that perhaps these connections are genuine, and perhaps coincidence itself is a form of meaning made visible through the fabric of reality. The divination system of the I Ching operates on precisely this understanding. At a specific moment, you cast coins or arrange yarrow stalks. The state of the cosmos at that exact moment is somehow reflected in the particular pattern that results. The pattern speaks to your situation not because you caused the result, but because you and the pattern are part of the same moment, the same web of meaning. This was a revolutionary and deeply challenging idea for Western scientific thinking. It fundamentally questioned the assumption that cause and effect is the only valid mode of connection between events. Jung suggested that perhaps the universe contains modes of connection we do not yet have adequate scientific language to describe. Jung engaged equally deeply with Tibetan Buddhism. He wrote a substantial psychological commentary for the English translation of what is known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This ancient sacred text describes in rich and precise detail the journey of consciousness through the process of death and toward eventual rebirth. It had long been considered a purely religious document of interest mainly to practicing Tibetan Buddhists. Jung read it differently. He found that the altered states of consciousness described in the text bore striking resemblances to states he had personally observed in patients undergoing deep psychological crisis, breakdown, or radical transformation. He believed that the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of contemplative practice was, in its essence, a sophisticated and ancient system of inner psychological exploration, simply encoded in the language and symbolic framework of that particular culture and tradition. This kind of cross-cultural and cross-religious perspective was unusual and intellectually daring in the Western academic world of his time. In his own distinctive way, Jung was building a bridge between the Eastern and Western traditions of understanding what it means to be a human being with an inner life. There is another essential concept in the architecture of Jung thought that must not be overlooked. He called it individuation. Individuation is very different from individualism. Individualism is about asserting the self against others. Individuation is about becoming truly and fully oneself. It is the lifelong journey of integrating all the different and often contradictory aspects of a personality into a coherent and authentic whole. This includes the acknowledged and the hidden, the conscious and the unconscious, the rational mind and the intuitive knowing of the deeper self. Jung said that genuine psychological growth does not mean eliminating inner conflict or achieving a state of perfect inner harmony. It means finding a higher and more inclusive point of integration within the experience of conflict itself. The tension between opposites is not a problem to be solved and discarded. It is the very engine of growth and transformation. This understanding resonates powerfully with the Chinese philosophical tradition of finding unity not by eliminating opposition but by holding the tension of opposites until something new and more inclusive can emerge. Individuation is a journey without a final destination. It is a continuous and living process of inward exploration and expanding self-knowledge that continues until the moment of death. In his later years, Jung built a stone tower by the shores of Lake Zurich at a place called Ballingen. He laid every stone with his own hands, working slowly and deliberately over many years. He said that the tower was the physical embodiment of his inner self. Each stage of construction represented a chapter in his own ongoing journey of individuation. He lived there alone for extended periods, without electricity, without the comforts and distractions of modern life. In that place of silence and simplicity, he listened to the voice of his own depths. Jung held a profound and distinctive view of dreams that set him apart from Freud in fundamental ways. Where Freud saw dreams as elaborate disguises for repressed desires, Jung understood them differently. For Jung, dreams were not concealing something. They were revealing something. Dreams were messages sent from the unconscious to the conscious mind. Gifts of information and orientation from the deeper layers of the psyche. Dreams speak in the language of symbols and images. The same ancient symbolic language used by myths, fairy tales, sacred stories, and ritual across all cultures. Jung developed an extraordinarily rich and subtle system for working with dreams over many decades of clinical practice. He insisted that understanding a dream could not be done by applying a fixed dictionary of symbols. Each dream needed to be understood in the full living context of the dreamer, their life situation, their relationships, their history, and where their soul was trying to move. His therapeutic approach was less focused on tracing the origins of problems in childhood wounds, as Freud preferred to do. Jung asked a different question. He asked not where have you come from but where does your soul need to go next? What needs to be recognized, integrated, and brought into the light? He said that the healing comes not from finding and naming the problem, but from finding a larger self within which the meaning of the problem is transformed. In 1913, in the difficult months following his rupture with Freud, Jung entered the darkest and most dangerous period of his life. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious. His sense of stable identity began to dissolve. Powerful visions arose unbidden at all hours of the day and night. Figures spoke to him from within. Strange and overwhelming images flooded his inner world. His family was frightened for him. His colleagues wondered if he was heading toward a breakdown from which he might not return. But Jung made a remarkable and courageous decision. Instead of fighting the darkness or retreating from it, he chose to move deliberately into it. He began keeping detailed records of every vision, every image, every voice, every dream that arose. He drew pictures of what he saw. He wrote extended dialogues with the figures that appeared in his inner world. He gave names to the voices and engaged with them directly. This practice, which he later called active imagination, became one of his most important therapeutic tools. The process of deliberate engagement with the contents of the unconscious continued for nearly 6 years. The records of this extraordinary and harrowing interior journey became the raw material for one of his most astonishing works, a book called The Red Book. Jung created it himself on large parchment pages. He wrote with a calligraphy brush and a careful hand. He illustrated every chapter with vivid and complex paintings and drawings, all done by his own hand. The Red Book was not a theoretical text. It was the direct record of one of the deepest minds in intellectual history wrestling naked and unguarded with the abyss within. But Jung never published it during his lifetime. After his death, the family locked it in a metal safe for 48 years. It was finally published to the world in 2009. The reaction was immediate and extraordinary. Scholars, artists, therapists, and curious readers around the world were stunned by what they found in those pages. The book revealed that the darkness Jung had entered was real, and that he had found, through sustained courage and creativity, a path toward light on the other side. Jung spent his later years writing with remarkable productivity, traveling extensively, and engaging with an ever-widening range of ideas and traditions. He visited indigenous communities in East Africa and observed their mythologies and ritual life at close quarters. He spent extended time among the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico. He traveled to India to engage with the living traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism. Each of these journeys added new layers of confirmation and nuance to his understanding of the collective unconscious. In 1951, he published a substantial work titled Psychology and Alchemy. Many readers were puzzled. Why would a psychologist of international standing devote years of serious scholarship to studying medieval alchemical texts? Jung explained his thinking clearly. Alchemy was never simply a failed attempt to transform lead into gold. What the great alchemists were truly engaged in was a form of psychic transformation work. They were working with the contents of their own unconscious minds, projected outward onto the materials in their laboratories. Their elaborate symbolic diagrams and mysterious imagery were not superstitious nonsense. They were humanity attempting, without the benefit of modern psychological language, to map and describe the real processes of the unconscious psyche. Jung reinterpreted the entire Western alchemical tradition through the lens of analytical psychology. The scholarly world was divided and shaken. Once again, the breadth of Jung's mind and the reach of his imagination had pushed far beyond the borders his contemporaries had assumed were fixed. In his later years, Jung also turned his serious attention to the psychology of religion. In a major work titled Answer to Job, written when he was in his late 70s, Jung did something extraordinary and controversial. He turned the tools of analytical psychology directly onto the figure of God as depicted in the Hebrew Bible. He argued that the story of Job revealed something important about the inner life of the divine as humanity had imagined it. That the divine itself, in the symbolic framework of Western religion, contained both a light and a shadow side. That the suffering of Job represented a moment when the human being, precisely through his integrity in the face of unjust suffering, became in some sense more conscious than the God who had allowed that suffering. This was profoundly provocative theology. Many religious readers were outraged. Others found it deeply illuminating. What matters for our purposes is what it reveals about the breadth and courage of the intellectual life of Jung. He was not afraid to apply his own framework to any domain of human experience, including the most sacred. His curiosity was genuinely unlimited. Carl Jung died on the 6th of June 1961, at the age of 85. In the days before his death, he was still working, still revising the pages of manuscripts he cared about. On the afternoon of his death, his family reported that a great tree outside his home at Kusnacht was struck by lightning. It was as though the natural world was marking the passing of someone who had spent a lifetime listening to its deepest languages. There is one more dimension of the life of Jung that we should acknowledge honestly, because Jung himself would have insisted on it. The dimension of his personal contradictions and shadow. Jung was, by any measure, a deeply complex and at times difficult man. His marriage to Emma Rauschenbach, which lasted nearly 50 years until her death in 1955, was by all accounts a relationship of deep intellectual and emotional significance. Emma Jung was herself a gifted analyst and scholar who made significant contributions to Jungian thought in her own right. But Jung also maintained a long and complicated relationship with Toni Wolff, a woman who became both his patient and his intellectual companion. This arrangement caused great pain within his family. Jung never fully resolved this dimension of his personal life, and it would be dishonest to present him as a man who perfectly embodied his own teachings. He was, as he himself taught, a human being living with his own unintegrated shadow. The courage of the Jungian tradition is that it does not require its founder to have been perfect. The insights are judged on their own merit, not on the moral perfection of the one who first articulated them. Jung himself said that the most dangerous person is the one who is identified with their light side and has no relationship with their darkness. He did not pretend to have solved that problem in his own life. He was, to the end, a work in progress. And perhaps that honesty about incompleteness is itself one of the most valuable things he modeled for us. Before we close, let us take a moment to trace the extraordinary reach of the influence of Jung across fields that might seem, at first, to have nothing to do with clinical psychology. In the world of literature, the Jungian framework of archetypes and the hero journey was adopted and systematized by the scholar Joseph Campbell in his landmark work titled The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Campbell made the Jungian model accessible to millions of readers worldwide. And his ideas were directly absorbed into the storytelling principles taught in Hollywood. George Lucas has spoken openly about how the work of Campbell shaped the structure of the original Star Wars films. The hero journey, the descent into darkness, the confrontation with the shadow, the return with wisdom. These Jungian patterns are embedded in the most successful stories the modern entertainment industry has produced. In the world of personality psychology, the model of psychological types developed by Jung, his theory of introversion and extroversion, and his 8 functional types became the foundation for the Myers-Briggs type indicator. This personality assessment tool has been used by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. It has influenced hiring processes, leadership training programs, and personal development work across virtually every industry on Earth. Whether one agrees with the specific instrument or not, the foundational Jungian insight that underlies it remains profound. Human beings differ not only in their content but in their fundamental orientation toward the world. In the broader culture, the language of Jungian psychology has quietly entered everyday speech. When people speak of the shadow side of a person, when they describe a situation as synchronistic, when they talk about a midlife crisis as a call to individuation, when they refer to an archetype in a film or novel, all of this language flows from the intellectual revolution that Carl Jung set in motion. He gave humanity a new vocabulary for the inner life. And that vocabulary has proven extraordinarily durable and alive. In the field of depth psychology itself, the legacy of Jung continues in the practice of Jungian analysis, in active imagination as a therapeutic technique, in the serious study of dreams as a primary source of psychological information, and in the integration of spiritual and mythological dimensions into the understanding of the human psyche. Analysts trained in the Jungian tradition work in clinics, universities, and private practice all over the world. The Jungian tradition has also been particularly hospitable to the integration of Eastern philosophical perspectives into Western psychological practice. Meditation, mindfulness, the I Ching, Tibetan Buddhist visualization practices. All of these find a more natural home within the Jungian framework than within most other Western psychological traditions. Why does Jung thought remain so vital and relevant today? Let me offer 3 reasons. The first reason is that he gave us a way to understand the shared foundation beneath all human diversity. In our era of globalization, intercultural tension, and political polarization, Jung's theory of the collective unconscious carries profound practical significance. It tells us that beneath all the surface differences of culture, religion, language, history, and worldview, there is a common deep structure of the human mind. Our universal resonance with stories of heroism and sacrifice. Our shared confrontation with mortality and loss. Our common capacity for love and for cruelty. These arise from the same ancient depths in every human being. This perspective does not erase difference, but it grounds difference in a shared humanity. It is a powerful and much-needed foundation for cultural understanding and human reconciliation. The second reason is that he taught us to face what he called the shadow. In a world that increasingly rewards the performance of positivity, the curation of perfect images, and the projection of flawless virtue, Jung's warning is more urgent than ever. Denying the shadow does not make it disappear. It drives it underground, where it accumulates unchecked power. This is true for individuals, for communities, and for entire nations. The moments in history when great harm has been done in the name of righteousness are often the moments when collective shadow has erupted from long and unexamined denial. The only viable response is to turn toward the darkness within ourselves honestly, courageously, and with a willingness to be changed by what we find. The third reason is that he provided a psychological framework for the spiritual hunger of modern people. Many people today find they cannot sincerely return to traditional religious structures and doctrines. Yet they also find that a life oriented entirely around material goals feels hollow and without genuine meaning. Jung offered a middle way through this dilemma. You do not need to believe in a specific deity or adopt a specific tradition. But you can recognize that the human psyche has dimensions that reach beyond the individual self. You can encounter that ancient and deep collective layer through myth, through the honest examination of your dreams, through art, through nature, and through the disciplined practice of looking inward. In that encounter, you may find something that feels unmistakably like genuine meaning. Jung once formulated something worth carrying with you. He said that whatever we have not lived out within ourselves will become our fate. The aspects of ourselves that we have suppressed, denied, or been too afraid to explore do not dissolve. They accumulate. They return in different forms throughout our lives. In the difficulties we cannot seem to escape. In the relationship patterns that repeat themselves despite our best intentions. In the dreams that disturb our nights. In the symptoms our bodies develop to speak what our minds refuse to acknowledge. All of these are invitations. They are asking us to turn around and face what we have been avoiding. To recognize it, to integrate it, and finally to live it out. That thought is offered with warmth and respect to every one of you who is on the journey of becoming yourself. I am Jenny. See you next time.